understand the mystery. First take a look at the history. The words we use will give us clues. So join us now in Church Chatter.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to episode 22 of the Church Chatter podcast, where we unpack a different church word or phrase each week. I'm Sam. I have my doctorate in language and culture, and I study religious linguistics.
And I'm Dillon, and I have a Master of Divinity, and I'm an ELCA Lutheran pastor.
Today, we are going to talk about a word I think Dillon can vouch for this.
I'm obsessed with.
I'm obsessed with the word power. I'm obsessed with it. Obsessed is an understatement. So let's start with some etymology. The word power comes from the old French word, I'm going to mispronounce this, pouvoir, which meant ability or capacity. This in turn derived from the Latin word potere. I think I'm saying it right.
Yeah, potere.
Potere. What, you know how to pronounce Latin words?
Oh, I took 2 years of Latin.
I took 4 years of Latin, and I know pasumne ira alla trinum. May I use the bathroom? That's all I remember.
In nomine Patre, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Yeah.
You're just bragging now. Okay, so the word power comes from the old French word, which meant ability or capacity, and then that's derived from the Latin word potere, meaning to be able. So the root of this Latin word potere is potus, meaning able or powerful. And over time, the meaning of this word power expanded to encompass not only the ability to act or accomplish something, but also physical strength, influence, authority, control, everything that we think about now with power. So as you know, I'm into the culture behind words. So let's put this into some cultural context. Obviously, the word power is a really big undertaking, but we have to put it in the context of patriarchy. So would you agree?
I would, of course.
Can't talk about power without talking about masculinity and femininity. I've said this before, I'm going to say it again. You can't separate culture and biology. People, especially politicians, are obsessed with doing it, but the culture that our bodies are dropped in influence our biology. That is measurable, that is scientific, that is true. Our culture influences our brain, it influences our DNA, our genetics, our literal genes that can be viewed with a microscope, right? These things are influenced by culture. So I'm not interested in having a conversation about what's natural and what's not natural. Culture is natural. Just like an ant builds an anthill, when humans create a society, that is part of nature. We are not separate from it. So power has to be put in the context of the patriarchy. Masculinity, I don't care if it's biological or cultural. Whatever it is, we've got it. It evolves. It always has evolved. And we have the power to define these things, right? So for a long portion of our history, men have been sent outside of the home to participate in public life, and women have been restricted to inside the home to participate in domestic life. Men, because they were leaving the home, claimed power for themselves. This is putting a very long history in short, but they claimed power for themselves. So the way power is structured is very masculine in nature. Here's what you need to know about masculinity. So, like, the huge feminine hormone is estrogen. Dylan, what's the huge masculine hormone?
Definitely not estrogen.
Testosterone. Yeah. So testosterone does not make a man violent. Testosterone, again, this is grounded in research. Testosterone does not encourage men to be violent or loud or dominating. Testosterone is the hormone that makes a man seek high status in whatever their culture decides is high status. We live in a patriarchal culture. Even if women tomorrow took all the positions of political power, it'd still be a patriarchy, because we're still operating under this masculine paradigm where masculine is better. Why is it that little girls can dress like Spider-Man and it's okay, but little boys dress like a princess and it's seen as a problem? Because anything that is deemed feminine is seen as a problem, right? Masculine in our culture. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I'm really trying to frame this before we get into what this has to do with Jesus and church and Christianity, right? So testosterone makes people with high testosterone, which are often men, but some women have higher levels of testosterone as well, right? People with higher testosterone seek status. So when you live in a patriarchal society set up like ours, where status is associated with money and war and violence and winning and competition, that's what bodies with a high level of testosterone are going to work towards. But if you live in a culture where things like cooperation and compassion are how you get status, how you are of value, then you bet your bottom dollar that those men are going to seek that kind of status, right? Now, for a lot of I'm telling you, I'm obsessed. I could go on a million bunny trails, and I probably will.
She's not lying to you.
I'm obsessed with understanding power.
I support her fully, but she's not lying to you.
So, again, this is like a very simplification of a huge simplification of history. But historically, whenever you live in, I hate the word civilized and uncivilized because it has such a connotation of like, I'm better than you. But in more uncivilized, kind of prehistoric cultures where there were no houses, there was not running water, all of these things, right? People lived in the wilderness. This is not a man-hating episode. Masculinity can be a beautiful, valuable thing as we understand it today. For example, if communities are living outside with dangerous animals, it makes sense that women have to nurse their babies and give birth, and they are responsible for collecting a majority of the calories, right? So yeah, maybe men went out and killed animals, but that was few and far between. Women were the ones responsible for collecting through gathering. They were collecting most of the caloric needs of the family, including the men, right? So women were providing in a big way. Hold on, let me just get this out really quick. So men had to fight animals. So competition and violence and strength became necessary. And that has shifted our DNA and our cultural focus, and we still see the legacy of that. The huge thing is, in our culture today, that's not of huge value in day to day. I'm not saying there's not a time and place for war, and that's very complicated, and I don't even know where I stand on it on any given day. But go ahead, what were you going to say?
Well, there's this, there's kind of this old notion of that men in particular are two things. They are the two P's, the protector and the provider. So men are the protector and they're the provider. But if you actually look at ancient kind of civilizations in both the East and the West, you will find that, especially in hunter-gatherer, non-agrarian. So when you have an agrarian society, it's a society that is farming, and they're staying in one community. Right. But hunter-gatherer are kind of moving around, and they're kind of nomadic. Okay, but so when women are staying at home and they're caring for children, and
they're providing.
They're providing by making meals,
making milk with their bodies,
gathering different things. The idea that the man is the sole provider is not true.
It's false. Yeah.
It's a co-providing, right? And also the protection part. A man who is out in the woods, far away from the camp, hunting, is not able to be the sole protector. Right. So this idea that a man is the only one that protects the family or the woman, that's never been true.
That's good.
That's
Here's
never
another
been
thing.
True. Not that the man that the man can't provide, or the man
men
can't
are
protect.
providing,
They
but
are
they're not
providing,
the only
but
providers.
it's always been an overlapped kind of working together.
Yeah, that's really good. I haven't told you this, but I'm going to tell you now on our podcast.
Lovely.
I've heard you say this a lot, but I heard you the other day say it in casual conversation. Something that Dillon says that I love is He doesn't say, like, if we're talking about a woman having a job, he doesn't say, does she work? He'll say something like, oh, she works outside of the home. And I heard you say that the other day casually in conversation. I was in the other room and I loved it so much. Because even just this language, again, this podcast is about the culture behind language. When we say, oh, she doesn't work. Well, we have an economy, especially in the United States, among other Western communities, nations, that is set up where men get to leave the home and go work because they have somebody doing their laundry, feeding them, packing them food, doing their budget, cleaning, right? Doing the shopping and like taking constant inventory of the home of, oh, we need more toilet paper. Oh, we need this. Men couldn't do that. For a majority of history, men would not be able to work the way that they do outside of the home and make money for the family if it wasn't for women doing that work. So whenever we say, oh, she doesn't work, what we're saying is she doesn't make money, but you bet your bottom dollar she's contributing to the money making that is happening in the team that is the domestic family. So it's kind of a side trail. I think that's important. We need to shift our language and say she works in the home or she doesn't work outside of the home because women, and increasingly the number of men, people who work inside the home. Dillon and I have both had our shares of spending months inside the home and taking care of children and doing the domestic labor. And that, for both of us, was harder and more work than leaving the house for a paid job.
Yeah, anyone that works in the home and does labor within the home, with children, without children, caring for a home, housekeeping, the keeping of a house, and other types of things. That is work, yes. And it's hard work, especially if it's. I don't want to say especially if it's done well, but if you're really putting your whole being into that, that is a lot of work, and that has not always been appreciated.
It's undervalued for sure. I think on a regular basis, something I think in my head is like, wow, we have to work really hard around here to keep a mediocre home. We're working really hard just to barely have half our laundry clean at all times. It's crazy. Okay. So why are we talking about all this in relationship to power? So I'm going to talk kind of fast because we have a lot to say. I could actually do a whole podcast every week, do an episode just on a different thing related to power. I'm that obsessed. The book that I have coming out next year is all about religious language and power. A book that I'm writing right now has a lot to do with language and power. I'm obsessed with power. Okay. When we think of power, so just think of if I say, wow, that person is so powerful. Like, what do you picture? Chances are it has something to do with strength and conquering and violence and force and domination and control, right? We don't think of things when we think of power. We don't often think of things like compassion, compromise, communication, empathy, vulnerability, which is a word we're going to talk about. So I know Dillon will know what I'm talking about, but a few years ago, I will never forget a conversation I had with somebody when politics came up. I think it was after the Russia-Ukraine thing started. And we were just talking about politics and power. And I said something about how if people in positions of power in our world could learn to communicate and compromise and have compassion with each other, our world would be better off. And this person said to me, oh, so if we were weak, if we showed weakness. Do you remember that?
I do.
And that will always stay with me because I started to wake up in a big way. A lot of people think this. They think compromise and empathy and compassion is weak. So many people equate these things with weakness and the opposite of power. But newsflash, in Christianity, we followed Jesus. And he was not violent, and he did not conquer. He did not use force. He did not dominate. Instead, he was loving and compassionate and empathetic. And here's the big one. He was vulnerable. And that's what I really want to talk about in a huge portion of this episode. So this episode is about power, which is a word that all of my research and writing is about power. It focuses around this concept of what is power, what could power be. And it's a word that we are all using differently. And if you are listening to this podcast, you are probably a Christian or Jesus leaning, or at least somewhat interested, or you just love me and Dillon, I don't know. But chances are you're interested in the Christian story in some way if you're listening to this podcast. So the thing that I challenge you to do after listening to this podcast episode is just lean into the Jesus story and really think about what Christianity says about power, because it's probably not fully in alignment with what the rest of the world says that power is. And Christianity, actually, we're going to talk about this, flips the notion of power on its head. So there are a lot of angles that we could approach this word power from. We could talk about feminism, womanism, which is like feminism focused around the Black experience and centers the Black woman. Patriarchy, we could talk about racism, we could talk about colonialism and white supremacy. We could talk about ableism. We could talk about all these things. All these things are wrapped up in our notions of power. But this podcast is about Christianity and church language. So we are going to talk about this context. So even from this perspective, there is so much to say. This episode is not a complete conversation about power as it's related to Christianity, because that would take centuries to unpack. This is just a few thoughts about power in the context of Christianity to maybe make the point, hopefully make the point, that Christianity actually flips power on its head. So that's just the introduction. Do you have anything to add to the introduction?
I do not.
All right. So I first want to talk about resistance. Okay. I know I'm talking a lot because, again, this is like my topic, but Dillon does have a lot to say too, so don't worry. Let's talk about resistance. So we can't talk about power without first talking about resistance. And I'm going to share something that I already shared on Instagram and Facebook, but I want to talk about it here too. So the Super Bowl halftime show with Kendrick Lamar. If it didn't make sense to you, and listen, by the way, me too. I didn't watch it live. I watched it the day after. But if I was watching the halftime show live, I probably would have thought to myself, wow, I don't, this isn't music I'm familiar with, and I don't really understand these lyrics. However, if it didn't make sense to you, the concept of hidden transcripts, which is written about by somebody named James C. Scott, can help explain why. So I read his work for the first time during my dissertation research many years ago, and it's one of the books that has really changed everything for me. So the kind of the summary is, throughout history, resistance efforts of the oppressed groups who are being harmed by power structures have been hidden in plain sight. So forms of opposition and protests happen openly, but oftentimes those in positions of power, like us white people, are so out of touch with the experience of those on the bottom of our social hierarchies of the oppressed that the revolution can literally be televised right in front of us during a Super Bowl halftime show, and we would miss it. We wouldn't see the power and what's happening. Does that make sense, the way I explained it? Mm-hmm. Okay, so there's a lot of examples of this, right? So one is the Bible. So let's remember that the Bible was written by the losers of the wars, which is why so many of us who live in a nation with the largest military industrial complex this world has ever known, which is the United States, right? We might miss some of the central themes of the Bible because the Bible has always been for the oppressed. Jesus was speaking and teaching to the oppressed. When those with power try to read the Bible, the revolutionary themes will not resonate with us until we shift our perspective to align with the perspective of the oppressed, because that's who Christianity was for. Would you agree?
Oh, I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. Another example is enslaved people in the United States. They found ways to communicate openly with each other right in front of their enslavers without the enslavers even knowing that they were engaging in acts of resistance. For example, they changed the tempo of some of their songs to communicate things. They used specific quilt patterns. They used specific hand gestures in the fields when they were working to share information about escape routes and possible dangers that were coming their way, right? Another example is women and reproductive rights. There are hidden transcripts containing instructions for women to be able to control their periods, to control menstruation and reproduction, like whether or not they wanted to get pregnant, right? These transcripts have been found throughout the world. Women in male-dominated societies around the world have been circulating this information. For example, the Bible has this too, myrrh. Whenever we have women dousing themselves in myrrh for months in preparation, I know I said this on a lot of podcast episodes, but in preparation to see a king, they're not trying to smell good. They are trying to make it, because what happens when a woman is with a king, you might need some birth control. right? And myrrh was a method of birth control to not ensure, but to decrease the likelihood that they would get pregnant, right? But men missed this. We continue to miss this. Mother passed down information to daughter for generations, but men missed it because they didn't know to be looking for it, and it was right in front of them. Another example, and I like the way I worded it on Facebook, so I'm going to say it the same way. Kendrick Lamar's Super Bowl halftime show in the year of our Lord 2025. Dillon loves when I say in the year of our Lord. Kendrick Lamar's Super Bowl halftime show was resistance in plain sight, and those of us who are not oppressed in the same way as that community, Black people, right, the Black community, we missed it. And I think that's really important to say, right? So oftentimes this concept of power, if everything seems okay, but people are trying to scream that it's not, we could miss it.
Well, yeah, and you've already mentioned a kind of a broad brush of the biblical narrative, meaning the biblical stories. But the book of Revelation, which is the last book of the Bible of the New Testament, this is what happens when the book of Revelation was written to a specific audience in a specific time with a specific history,
who were being oppressed,
with a specific culture and language and religion, who were being oppressed, and they were being taken over by a tyrannical empire, and Paul and John of Patmos, who is the assumed author of that text, was writing in symbolic and metaphorical ways to be able to relay a message that only those who were under the oppression would know.
Yes.
And what happens is, thousands of years later, instead of looking at that text historically and seeing how that was uplifting and helpful for those people at that time, and still can be of some help maybe today, I'm not negating that, but instead of keeping that text in its time and its place and its culture and how those people were being oppressed in a specific part of history, we are reading that with as people that are not oppressed, that are not in that culture, that are not in that history, and we're almost ruining it.
Yeah.
We're almost ruining it, and we don't even get it. We don't even get it. People say, I just don't understand Revelation. Well, right, because it wasn't written to you.
Yeah, and to kind of ground that, like what Dillon is talking about, I mean, there's countless examples. One example is there's horses of many colors in Revelation. That does not mean there are literal horses of many colors that are going to be coming back when Jesus comes back. That's not what it's saying.
Right.
They're referring to the Domitian games. The emperor at the time of this text, the book of Revelation, was Domitian.
Horses.
He had something called Domitian games, which were very, very violent. Many people died. And part of these, you can almost think of it as like an Olympics, but more violent and tyrannical. So there were horses that were painted different colors. So John of Patmos is trying to write this text to a community of Jesus, many communities, 7 churches, but 7 communities of Jesus followers who would have understood these Domitian games as being oppressive in nature. And he's referencing images from these Domitian games. One more example is the mark of the beast. This is not a literal, like, not even literal, but this isn't the mark of it. Like, it's not a mark of the beast in the future. There is a literal, the beast was the emperor. You had to worship Emperor Domitian in order to get an ink mark on your hand or forehead or somewhere on your body to show people that you were allowed to participate in commerce, meaning you could buy. In Ephesus was like the community where commerce took place, where you could buy your goods and sell things. You needed to be able to participate in commerce to feed yourself, to sell your goods, to sell your services, all that kind of stuff. But if you didn't bow down and acknowledge Domitian as king, you wouldn't get that mark, and not king, as God. So, but that was a problem for Jesus followers. So am I making sense so far?
Yes.
So when John of Patmos was telling people, don't take the mark of the beast, whatever you do. He was saying it's better to die because you can't buy food than to call Domitian God because Jesus is God. We worship Jesus, and it's better to die than to participate in his oppressive system. That's what it was saying. It's about the past more than it's about the future. Anyway, go ahead.
The book of Revelation is exactly what you're talking about here. It is a text with hidden meanings that were given to a specific people in a specific time and place and culture. Now, some people might be listening to this podcast and saying, yeah, and some of those same things are happening today. And to which I would say, yes, but where it becomes problematic is when you are trying to take an ancient text and you are trying to match it up with current things that are happening. I'm not saying that similar things don't happen and can't happen, but when you're trying to paint a picture with an ancient Christian text and match them up to modern things and figure out when things are going to happen, that's not the purpose of that book. Nor is that the purpose of people like Kendrick Lamar, perhaps, per se, or people like Martha Beck, or people like other different types of people. Yeah, I don't know.
I'm going to talk about Martha Beck in a minute.
I thought you already talked about Martha
Beck. No, not yet.
But, and so people are, you can't, they're things that may be similar are not always identical.
Right. You can't read the book of Revelation without understanding its relationship to power and oppression and resistance. That is a book of resistance, and a lot of what was being said in almost like the enslaved people in the United States who would sing to a different tempo in order to communicate something bad's about to happen, prepare yourself, right? Or they would quilt certain patterns into blankets that they had to make to communicate with people where they could go to escape, like where the escape routes were. In the same way, John of Patmos was writing to a very specific community who were oppressed and at the bottom of the totem pole of their social hierarchy in the Roman Empire. And he was writing using images and words that they would have understood to make the point, Jesus is Lord, not the Roman emperor. Do not participate in this evil, oppressive system. Better to die a Jesus follower. That, like, this has everything to do with power, right? Do you think we made that point well enough?
Yeah, I think we made the point. So when you're listening to music, or you're reading a text, or you're seeing something and you think, this doesn't make any sense to me, refocused and take it from the lens of who it was written to and when and why.
Yes.
And then it can open your eyes to something new, a newer understanding of what was it for that specific people at that specific time, and not necessarily having to think, oh, well, what does that mean?
Yes.
Okay. So I think we're kind of beating a dead dog here.
Yeah, but it's important to say. I think it needs to be said very directly and repetitively. But also, there's a reason why a lot of people who enter like a truly transformative, this is true of all religions, I think, but we're talking about Christianity. There's a reason why a lot of people don't connect with Christianity until something breaks them. Because the Bible and Christianity was tailored to people who were broken by the powerful. I have heard somebody, again, I'm not going to say names, but I thought it was so beautiful. Somebody told me that her husband didn't really connect with the Bible until he had enemies, until people were kind of against what he was trying to do in the world, the good things he was trying to do. And then some of the text started to make sense to him. And I think that's really powerful. Until we find ourselves under the boot of those with power, until we find people holding power over our heads in an oppressive way, oftentimes we can't, and that can look different for everybody. It's not always political. Sometimes it can just mean a group of friends who have kind of exiled you. It can mean a lot of things. But until power is over your head, you can't, or until you can learn to see through the eyes of people who are being oppressed by people with power, only then can we truly understand what the Bible's trying to say.
I want to share one last thing for this section. Okay, so if you attend a church that reads a lectionary every week, which are specific assigned readings, like our church does, like the Lutheran Church does, and many other churches. And if you don't go to church, just listen to what I have to say, and maybe it would be helpful. So last week's readings on Sunday, coming from the Gospel of Luke, from St. Luke, was interesting. It was called The Blessings and Woes. And what was going on here is that people that were very, very wealthy and very, very rich and extremely, extremely powerful in the community, they were people of merchants, they were business people, they were merchants, or they were in government and high appointed political positions, they were aristocrats, all these different things. They were doing two things in this specific passage that we hear of in Luke's gospel, in which Jesus is calling out the woes of the people and encouraging people to bless others. There was two things going on. The rich and the wealthy and the powerful were neglecting the sick and the hungry. They were not providing food to people. They were not caring for people who were desperately sick. And Jesus's words towards those who were sick and hungry, he said, he gave blessing to them. He said, "Blessed are those who are sick. Blessed are those who are hungry, for they need to be uplifted." And Jesus says, "And woe to you who are rich and powerful, and neglect them."
Yes.
And so sometimes when you are above everything, when you have so much money and so much power, number one, you don't need God, or at least you don't think that you need God. So you're God. You become God. And then you neglect the very, very most vulnerable people in your own home, in your own family, in your own community, people who are hungry, people who are sick. And so what you were just saying, Samantha, is interesting, that sometimes something it might be something in your own life, or something in your family's life, or in your own community's life, maybe your church community, or maybe your just general community, in which, until your eyes are opened to see those on the margins, maybe the hungry, or maybe the sick, or maybe the people who don't have a home, or maybe people that are struggling with a multitude of different things, addiction and dependence. It is not until those points that you start to see the gross woes of those who are indeed powerful and rich, and then the ones whom Jesus calls blessed.
Yes, that's a really good segue into what I want to
Blessed.
talk about next, which is, you might wonder, like, why are they going on and on about power? Because the whole Bible for sure, but let's just talk about the four Gospels. Jesus' entire ministry cannot be understood until you understand that he is against the powers that exist. And back to your point, you said something really interesting about the book of Revelation and how you can't read it looking for, like, oh, these things are happening now, these are signs. The reason these things are happening now is because the issues that humanity had with power and abusing power 2,000 years ago, we haven't fixed it. Jesus came to try to fix it, and I think we're on a certain trajectory, but we haven't really even scratched the surface of the power of Christianity yet. We haven't even scratched the surface of the radicalness of Jesus yet. Instead, we've made him tolerable, but he was a radical, and he was trying to tell people, no, there's another way. Like, we're going to talk about lions and lambs in a couple minutes, and there's another way to have power on this planet, in this reality. So you can't, the reason that we see things happening, or we think we see things happening that was discussed in the book of Revelation, a huge reason is because, we still are abusing power. So the same thing is going to keep happening over and over again.
And here's an interesting thing. I want to make this very clear. I used that example from St. Luke's Gospel with Jesus, the blessings and the woes. Here's the interesting thing. Sometimes people have gone from one side to the other, and they can't find the third way in which Jesus was speaking of. and that is this. Jesus isn't saying that you can't be a person of means, or you can't be a person of wealth, or you can't be a person who serves in government,
right.
or you can't. That is not what Jesus is saying. It's not that he's saying that you can't be a person of wealth, or you can't be even a person of power. What Jesus is saying is, when you find yourself as a person of wealth or as a person of power, and you turn your face away from God and neighbor, you are neglecting the very gifts of power and wealth that have been given to you, and you are using them for selfish, gross gain.
That's good. The Bible doesn't say money is evil. The Bible says the love of money
The
is
love
evil.
of
There's
money.
a difference.
So you can be a person of great power and great wealth, and Jesus is talking about, and how are you I'm going to use the word, how are you redistributing that to those around you that find themselves in current need?
That's a really good introduction. It just worked out to what I want to say next. Jesus says it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. Jesus doesn't say it's impossible for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God, but says it's pretty darn hard, because whenever we become attached to our wealth or our resources, more so than caring for humanity and creation, that's a problem, right? So Jesus says it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. This is because the messages of Jesus, I know we're really beating a dead horse here, but the messages of Jesus were not for the rich and powerful. So Dillon kind of teased this, but I want to talk about Martha Beck. Martha Beck, you can look her up if you want. She's great. She has a book called Beyond Anxiety where she talks. It's just beautiful. It's a good book. But she has this thing on Instagram, and I'm going to explain it right now. And I actually think I'm going to do it with my Sunday school class in a couple weeks. So really hang in there with me, because this is a beautiful, powerful image. So Jesus in the Bible talks a lot about the meek having the power and about the poor being blessed and all these things, right? The Bible says this over and over and over again. The people at the bottom of social structures who are being oppressed, those are God's people, over and over again, right? Would you agree?
I would say that everyone's God's people,
Sure.
but the biblical narrative in both the Hebrew Scriptures and the New Testament, there is what professional theologians and pastors would call a preferential option for the poor.
Preferential, I love that.
That God and the prophets in the Old Testament have a preferential option for the poor. And Jesus and the apostles have a preferential option for the poor.
Yeah, that's good. So here's what Martha Beck did, and hang in there with me. I'm going to explain this as well as I can. So she has a pie dish, like a deep pie dish, and she has sugar cubes. And the sugar cubes are in the shape of a pyramid. So there's a bunch of sugar cubes on the bottom, and then it's in a pyramid, where it's like a triangle pyramid, right? To the point where on the top there's only one sugar cube. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. Inside of a pie dish. That is our culture. We have a couple people at the top, politicians, the top 1%, all these rich people in positions of power. But then at the bottom are, throughout history we've called them peasants, right? Or like the working class, people in poverty, right? People at the bottom. Now something is dying in our culture. I think, especially for people who are spiritually leaning. We're all spiritually leaning, but you know what I mean? Like people who are interested in these topics. Something old is dying and something new is coming. There's like an upgrade of humanity happening right now. And many of us, Dylan's laughing at me, many of us, including me, believe something spiritual is taking place. A lot of humans are waking up in recent decades especially, and there's like a huge backlash right now, but we are waking up to wait a second. This system that we call capitalism, this system that we call democracy, is excluding and even harming and killing, flat out killing people at the bottom of this pyramid. So picture the pyramid, and the pyramid has solid sugar cubes, right? And then you take water, and you can put food dye in this water. Take a cup of water, put food dye in it so you can see it. God is water, right? God is water. God is this flexible being. It kind of runs through us, right? It can change form. God is water. So you have this deep pie dish, you have this pyramid of sugar cubes. If you pour the water, which is God, into this society, this pyramid society, this hierarchy of sugar cubes, which is us people, right? Am I explaining it well so far? Mm-hmm. If you pour this water, so let's pretend it's orange water, right? Let's call it purple, actually. Purple's a color of power, right? So picture this purple water. It's water with purple food dye in it, right? Purple water. You pour it into the pie dish. What happens? Remember, the water, this purple water is a metaphor for God. What happens pretty quickly in this sugar cube pyramid of power, of society, and the way we arrange ourselves, is the bottom people, the bottom sugar cubes, become immersed in this purple water and they dissolve into God. And that's what Jesus is talking about. Jesus talks about how it is very difficult for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God, right? It's very difficult for the people at the top of this sugar cube pyramid to dissolve into God, but they do eventually. They're just the last to see it. So going back to those hidden transcripts, going back to the halftime show, right? People at the top, it's very difficult for them to be immersed in God, to dissolve into God, to experience salvation, enlightenment, however you want to describe it. But if you pour this purple water into this dish, within 2 or 3 minutes, so first it's the people at the bottom who dissolve into God. They wake up and they see society for what it is, as harming people at the bottom. People at the bottom are the ones who wake up and dissolve into God and awareness and spirituality first. That's why the Bible and so many religions talk to the people at the bottom, the people who are being oppressed, because for whatever mysterious divine truth, people at the bottom wake up first. They have a deeper connection with God first. There's something about suffering and brokenness and vulnerability that connects you to God in a very direct way. Which, if you think about your own life, you probably feel that. When things are going well, you probably don't feel very close to God, but when things go wrong, do you feel divine connection? Right? If you're able to surrender to it, you can feel it. So again, picture this purple water, it goes in. The bottom is what dissolves into God and this awakening, salvation, whatever you want to call it first. But eventually the entire pyramid collapses, and even the ones at the top become purple, sugary, sweet water. Are condensed into this spirituality, this God, this kingdom of God, this salvation, this enlightenment. I mean, there's so many words to describe it. Does that make sense? Did I explain that in a way that makes sense?
That would preach.
Yeah, I wish I could actually do it here, but Martha Beck has it on her Instagram. I'm probably going to do it with my Sunday school class. But the point is, power is made perfect in weakness, right? 1 Corinthians says that. Our weakness is where the power and connection and God and divinity shows up in a clear way. And it has everything to do with meekness and power. I hope that makes sense. Go ahead.
No, that's interesting because there's this passage in 1 Timothy in the New Testament, Christian New Testament, which when a lot of times people are trying to say, well, some of these people God enjoys and some of these people God doesn't enjoy, or sometimes you'll get language like, well, these people are saved and these people aren't saved, or these people are experiencing God and these people are not experiencing God, and all this type of stuff. What you just explained is that eventually, if God is like the sugar cube experience with the purple food dye and the water, that God literally saturates every bit of creation, not only is that grounded in the Old Testament and the Hebrew scriptures, in which in the book of Genesis we're told that every single person, arguably not just humanity, but every single part of creation is given this, is made in the image of God. So there is a spark of God in us all.
I was sick.
A spark of God.
I was sick 2 weeks ago, and this week is Dillon's turn. He's coming off of a couple days of being quite sick, so give him a minute.
So if God...
Do you need a minute?
No. If God is in everyone, which is grounded in the Jewish tradition, that everyone is made in the image of God. A teaching that Christians also accept. There's this passage in 1 Timothy that says that God desires and wills that all people will come and understand the salvation that has been given to them and accept the fullness of knowledge of truth. So that doesn't mean that some get it and some don't get it. God wills and desires, because the spark is in us all, that we all come to awaken. Sometimes it might be quicker than others, but the desire of God, the will of God, is that all people, that all of creation will experience salvation both in the here and in the hereafter.
But there again, there's something about power and oppression where those who do not have power in a given social structure seem to get it more clearly. They seem to wake up to divine truths more, I don't know if I want to say quickly, but first, right? They're like the canaries in the coal mine. They sense the danger first, right? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I do want to just drop in one quote here. Father Richard Rohr says that men, so specifically, remember we talked about patriarchy and how there's this like maleness when it comes to our culture's understanding of power. Men who are not, this is a direct quote from Richard Rohr. So if you don't know, Richard Rohr is a Franciscan Catholic priest. He's one of Dillon and I's favorite people to read. He's brilliant and so beautifully compassionate. He runs the Center for Action and Contemplation. And he has worked extensively with men in prison, with men in recovery. So he does like a lot of like male missionary kind of work. I don't know if missionary is the word he would use, but so this is a direct quote from him. Men who are not led on a journey of powerlessness will always abuse their power. So I'm not really going to extend on that. I just think it's something
that speaks
to think.
For itself.
Yeah, I think it's something to think about. What that journey looks like could be different in every family, individual, culture, faith community. But there's something about men and power that really needs to be reconciled there. And I mean, for sure, there's an angle to look at women too. So I want to talk about, I know we have a lot more to say. So accountability. I think this is important to talk about with power. It's so important to me. Oftentimes we can look outside of us, and that's important. We can look at politicians, we can look at our bosses, we can, whenever we're children, look at our parents, for sure. Anybody who's in a position of power over us. It's good to point outside of us, but it's also important to know that you cannot judge what is out. So I'll talk for me. I cannot judge what is outside of me without turning that same critical eye towards myself. So what I mean is, and I truly believe that this is how permanent change comes about. When I see other people hoarding resources and abusing their power, for example, I am one of the people who does not like Elon Musk. I am one of the people who does not appreciate when people who are billionaires and top 1%, I don't mind that they are billionaires. I do mind when they are still hoarding money and when people are starving, right? I think that's a huge problem, but it's also a Christian problem that Christians should have a real problem with. But when I see others hoarding resources and abusing their power, that's fine. I can point the finger at them, but I better also turn towards myself, because you can only see that which is present within you. If it's not in me, then it tends to not hit a nerve. What's the thing that we always say? That which is hysterical is historical. So if you have a hysterical reaction, even if it's righteous and just, if you are hysterical about something, if you are angry about something, chances are it's in your own personal history. So what I mean is, when I see other people hoarding resources and abusing their power and it really makes me mad, I have to then look at my own hoarding and abuse. Because if I'm disgusted with someone else's greed, I'm probably also disgusted with my own greed. So turn that inward. And for me, what that looks like is like, oh wow, I have 30 pairs of shoes and probably 15 of them I've never worn, right? I do that especially with high heels because I think I like high heels, but they're so uncomfortable. So I buy them and I never wear them. That's hoarding, right? Dylan and I can pay our bills and save enough money to go on a vacation every year if we're like really careful with our money, right? But still, I drive by people asking for money on the side of the road and I don't even look at them sometimes. Right? So if I'm going to be mad at people who have extra resources but aren't taking care of the people who are in need in their communities, I better be able to look at myself too and say, well, I can't hold other people accountable for their greed if I'm not also holding myself accountable. Even if mine's not to the same extent of rich, like the top 1%, I still have it in me. So if we need to be critical outside of us and critical inside of us, right? That's how we're going to have a healthier relationship with power as the human species. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that's kind of interesting because I think the season of Lent is coming up. And one of the tenets or practices of Lent is self-reflection, something that many people don't like to do so much.
Oh, it's painful.
And it's painful, and especially in the United States, self-reflection is not a very sexy thing to do. And we would rather point our fingers at other people that do things, including myself. I do it. I'm not exempt from that. I'll say, well, why shouldn't this group or why shouldn't this person be doing this? Well, what am I doing? Mm-hmm. What is Dillon doing?
Yeah.
And I think the Lenten practice of self-examination and self-reflection to get closer to God and neighbor is a good one. And that's coming up soon. Ash Wednesday will be here on March 5th. And that begins Lent, and it's always good to be self-reflective, to not just point the finger at some other person or some group, but to I hate to say point the finger, but to point the finger at your own being, at your own person, mm-hmm. and say, hey, what am I doing here? What do I need to look at? Is the power that I have, or the riches that I have, are they exploiting other people who are around me?
Yeah. I hope you're following, because I know that we're really saying a lot here, but I think it's all important.
Good.
The next thing I want to talk about, this is important to say, after we talk about holding ourselves accountable, I want to talk about disempowerment. So we can engage in this like act of self-accountability, self-reflection without walking around feeling guilty and crappy all day. We don't have to feel like I'm a terrible person. No. Because
no mea culpa.
No mea culpa, right. So
that's good Latin.
We don't want to feel disempowered because that can be a weapon used against us and it's dangerous. And here's what I mean. Those who abuse power, they want us to feel like we don't have power. And disempowerment is dangerous because it makes us susceptible to looking to someone else to have power over us.
That's good.
So you need to feel a sense of humility and accountability, but you also want to feel a sense of empowerment as well, because as soon as a person or a community feels disempowered, what do? They look to a politician or a cult leader or something like that to save them, right? That can be a weapon used. Your own disempowerment can be a weapon used against you. Did I explain that in a way that makes sense? Okay. I think that's really important to say.
That was good and interesting with the cult leader.
Yeah. So we don't need to be disempowered. We just need to redefine what we see as being worthy of being called powerful. So I have a couple thoughts on that, and then I want to talk about like lion and the lamb, and then I want to get into what you have right there, which would be a good segue. Okay. Powerful people are free people. So Reverend Nadia Boltz-Weber, who's a Lutheran pastor, she says this about free people. And I have this quote hanging here next to me on my desk because I love it. I'm kind of paraphrasing right now, but she says, free people are not controlled by the past. Free people laugh more than others. Free people see beauty where others do not. Free people are not easily offended. Free people are unafraid to speak truth to stupid. And free people are not chained to resentment. When I see somebody, we all know some of these people. An empowered person is a liberated person. And liberated people hold things lightly. And that is true power. Control is my vice for sure. I like to control things. And I was way worse 5 or 10 years ago. I'm getting better. Kids can really make you or break you in that way, but they're making me a less controlling person. But if you see a person who's walking around trying to control everybody, that is not a liberated person. That is not an empowered person. If you see somebody who's just like terrified all the time, not liberated, not empowered. If you see somebody who's easily offended, not liberated, not empowered. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's something about liberation and power. Like, the people with the real power are the ones who hold reality kind of loosely. They're not super attached to outcomes. That doesn't mean that they're passive in the face of injustice and oppression. It just means that they have stepped into this kind of space of freedom. And they are not resentful. They're not walking around angry all the time. They're not those people who we all know who walk around saying how everything's going to shit. You know, those people are like, oh, it's just getting real bad around here. Those are not liberated people. They are not empowered people. Those are disempowered people. And they are probably the people who are looking outside of them, outside of divinity and God and Jesus for a savior to come fix everything. But I have so many thoughts, but I'll just let that sit. So
that's probably best.
When I see people walking around consumed with resentment to the point that they can't access their joy, that is not power. People who need to remind those around them that they are in charge. I'm sure a lot of you have had supervisors or bosses or CEOs or people who are over them at work who like to remind people, I'm in charge. That's not real power, right? People who need to remind everybody that they are in charge are not in power. I don't think I've ever said this to our children, but I've wanted to. Parents who have to tell their children over and over again, because I said so and you do what I say. That's not empowerment, right? I had a boss in my 20s who will remain nameless, and she liked to remind everybody that she was in charge, and she made every day full of anxiety and misery. And I knew deep in my bones, every time she reminded those who worked under her that she was in charge and things would be done her way, I so clearly saw her insecurity and disempowerment. And listen, I do it too sometimes. When I feel insecure, I double down on it. But my very next job, I had a boss who never gave orders. She never even needed to be seen as an authority figure. She gave so much freedom and liberation for us to do the work that we have been hired to do as we saw fit. And to this day, that was the best work environment I've ever had. She had nothing to prove. That was power. Power has nothing to prove. So let's connect it back to Jesus. Jesus did not try to prove himself to the powers who wanted to and eventually succeeded in killing him. He didn't try to prove himself. He didn't try to defend himself. He was not easily offended. He said, I am who you say I am. Right? Are you the king of the Jews? Right. You say that I am. He wasn't trying to defend himself. He understood what he was up against. So I want to talk about lions and lambs, and then I want to talk about like church power that you had a lot to say about. Okay. Okay. Jesus says multiple times, and we know this because it's in the Bible, that he was sending his followers out like lambs among lions. This is a concept when it comes to power, again, I'm obsessed with. He said that he was sending his followers out like lambs among lions. He knew that there were people in power who were like lions, people who worked for the Roman Empire. And those lions would never understand the power of a lamb. In fact, these lions would even be dangerous to the lambs. But danger does not equal powerful, and lions are not the permanent kind of power. There's a reason why at church each Sunday, a lot of churches say, Lamb of God, you take away the sin of the world. We don't say Lion of God, y'all. That's important. We say Lamb of God. We do not say Lion of God. This has everything to do with how followers of Jesus understand power, or at least should understand power. The lamb is gentle innocent, soft, non-aggressive, communal. Any other words you want to add to that list?
No, those are all good.
A lion is a symbol of strength, courage, self-reliance, aggression, defensiveness, right? And Jesus is called the Lamb, not the lion. And he is teaching other people to step into a kind of power that is the Lamb's power. And he's saying, yeah, I'm going to send you out like lambs among lions. And those lions are going to be dangerous, but you are still called to be a lamb. Gentle, innocent, soft, non-aggressive, communal. So just a big newsflash, Jesus was a lamb, and he spoke out against the lions of the world. So when we are sent out as lambs among lions, lions are not permanent. Lions are not worshipped. Lions are not powerful. Jesus knew there would always be lions who would not understand the way of the lamb, but Christians are called to be lambs anyway. Getting really excited.
Well, right, just like when I took my ordination vows, I was called to be that of a shepherd,
Right.
not a roaring lion.
Right. Right. So whenever we see...
the image of Jesus that you hear in John's Gospel, the image of Jesus as the good shepherd, pastors are called to be like Jesus in the position of a good shepherd, and we are, and the followers of the flock are sheep, non-violent animals. And even if you don't just have to, not just pastors or shepherds, although they're a lead shepherd usually in a community. This idea of a lamb or a sheep or a shepherd or the good shepherd, these once again are images of flipping power on its head and seeing power in a new way,
Yeah.
especially that Jesus speaks about.
Yeah, and I want to kind of give like a warning, something that I think is really important. Many people who were awaiting the Messiah before Jesus, and not all Jews were awaiting a Messiah, that's important to say, but a lot of them were, and they expected, now remember, if you listen to our episode 2, which is like our first real episode after introductions, it was on the word Christ. Remember, Messiah, the word Christ comes from the word Messiah. Messiah means anointed one, and kings were anointed with oil. So Christ is really a way to say like a king, right? So many people who are awaiting a Messiah before Jesus, they expected a literal king who would conquer their enemies and rule. But that is not, so if you're a Christian, you believe that Jesus was the Messiah who came to show a different way, that is not the Messiah that came. That is not what Jesus did, and that is not who he was. He was not a literal king. He did not conquer. He did not wage war on enemies. Instead, he said, love your enemies. That's pretty radical. That's pretty crazy. We throw these phrases around that Jesus said like they're nothing, but that is radical. And when I think, let's like really ground this. When I think about the best, most fruitful, beautiful, like divine parts of my life, none of them are connected to being a lion. Nothing good has come out of my life when there's something to be said for resilience. I struggle with that word, but like when we walk around trying to be strong and dominant all the time, the most beautiful parts of my life, and I think you would agree with your life too, come whenever I am compassionate, when I soften my edges a little bit, and when I am vulnerable. Mm-hmm. I connect to people when I am vulnerable and when I provide space for them to be vulnerable. I connect to people, and beautiful parts of my life grow when I kind of settle into this calm space of vulnerability and allow compassion. There's all these cliche words, but I think that's where the fruit is. That's where the power is. So all of this is to say, question power when you see it. This could be politicians, parents, bosses at work, yourself, anybody in power. Notice the kinds of traits that work and the kinds that don't. Aggression doesn't work. We've played that out, by the way. So if you're thinking like, well, a life without war, how would that work? You need it, blah, blah, blah. Well, we played that out. For many thousands of years, we have been doing war. We've been doing that masculine way of power. And look around. It didn't work. It was an experiment. We played it till its end. It didn't work. And 2,000 years ago, a lot of what Jesus was teaching his followers was trying to say, that old way isn't working. Don't you see? Like the way of the lion, the way of the lion isn't working. 2,000 years later, it's still not working. So let's change it up a bit. So, all right, Dillon's coughing. So our own Christian lineage, the Roman Empire fell. And there have been followers of Jesus longer than there were followers of the Roman Empire. And I think that's something to say. The way of Jesus has outlasted the way of the Roman Empire. I think that's really interesting. Okay. Dillon's throat is pretty dry.
I'm going to speed through what I have here. Just a couple of things. When we talk about power, and prestige and riches and where I'm sorry, I need a cough drop here.
We don't edit these videos, so you're just getting all of it.
You're getting us in our fullness.
I'm giving Dillon a cough drop. Okay, go ahead.
So when we talk about power, we have taken some of these understandings that if humanity does not possess the fullness of power, then God must be the one that does that, okay? And in the Christian religion, and specifically in Hinduism and Islam, the Muslim religion, there is something known as the three omnis, right? Omnipotence, which means all-powerful, omniscience, which means all-knowing, and omnipresent, which means everywhere.
Omniscience?
What?
Is it omniscience?
Omniscience. I don't know why I said science. And so we have the three of them. And so God is all-powerful, God is all-knowing, God is everywhere, okay? Christians for a long time, most denominations still officially even hold these understandings and teachings and practices, and yet not all the time do these three omnis hold up to the greater biblical narrative, to the experience of humanity over time and space. And so is God all-powerful all the time? That's one question. Is God all-knowing all the time? And is God everywhere all the time? You have to ask yourself that question. So when we're talking about questions of power, like we are in this episode, you can't really talk about Christianity without talking in terms of theology about the omnis. Now, hold on, I want to share something real quick. I am a baptized Christian. I am also an ordained pastor in the Lutheran tradition. I generally uphold these omnis, these three omnis, except that I deeply, deeply struggle with the first two, which are all-powerful and all-knowing. I'm pretty much on board with that God is everywhere. God is in our joy, God is in our suffering, God walks with us on the road. But when you have a God that is all-powerful all the time and all-knowing all the time, boy, you start to have you'll start to have a longing and a tugging of the mind and soul.
Well, but that's why we're doing this podcast episode, because to say that God is all-powerful, it depends on what you mean by all-powerful.
We're talking about all the time.
Hold on. If our definition of powerful is to be in control and able to manipulate and conquer and do whatever you want, yeah, I don't believe God's all-powerful. But if your definition of powerful is the ability to allow everything, the ability to be, like, my definition of powerful has a lot to do with not controlling, right? If we talk about those senses of empowerment and liberation, is not controlling everything all the time, because even if we just take that into our human experience, people who walk around trying to control everything all the time, manipulate, that's not power, right? That's not the kind of permanent lamb power that Jesus teaches about. But if your definition of power, like mine, includes being vulnerable, the ability to create the space for vulnerability, your own and others, to exist, then yeah, God's all powerful. Do you know what I mean? Like, what do we mean by power? It can't be that this cultural way of like dominance and war and control and manipulation. Instead, if we define power as vulnerable and compassion and Jesus's way of the lamb, then yeah, God's all powerful. Same with all knowing. Is God all knowing? That depends on how you define knowing. So my doctorate program, I always say I got my doctorate in language and culture, but the official program, I have my doctorate in literacy, culture, and language education. And we talked a lot in the context of literacy, of like ways of knowing. Every class I took was about ways of knowing. And throughout time and space, so like just throughout the globe and throughout history, we think of knowing like, oh, you know everything. Oftentimes our brain goes to the future. Like that means you know what's going to happen in the future. It means you know what's happening now. That's not how everybody thinks of knowing. A lot, especially like indigenous cultures, a lot of ancient cultures, to know something, and this might get a little like weirdly philosophical, but to know something for a lot of people throughout history and in present day, knowing was the ability to sit in stillness, right? And think of the Bible, be still and know that I am God, right? That's knowing. So, like meditation is a form of knowing, right? Knowing is not just knowing the future and knowing everything. Knowing is when you can sit in stillness and your awareness drops from head to heart and body, and there's this deep knowing, this deep hearing, this deep connection. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
So it depends
That's
on
very
how
good.
you're defining power and defining knowing, right?
Right.
Okay.
And so when we talk about power, it is important in the Christian religion to know that there is this old understanding that God is all powerful, all knowing, and God is everywhere. To which I agree to all three, but like many other of my colleagues, have some like Samantha just said, some openness to understanding what is all powerful, what is all knowing, what does it mean to be everywhere.
Do you agree with what I said?
I very
About
much
defining
agree with
power?
what you say. Yeah, I do. I still say that if you are limiting the all-powerful and the all-knowing to just kind of materialism and kind of understandings of knowing how we think humans are, and you start to think about some concepts or things that happen in the world, an all-knowing and an all-powerful God, if you're thinking about it just in a very simplistic way, that can get you in a pretty dangerous spot.
Yeah.
That God is everywhere and walking with us in both the good and the bad, that's a little bit less of a concern for most people. But you can't talk about power and God and not talk about the three omnis. All right, I want to move on. There's this concept about power and God. Many people have stated and come up with theologies and philosophies that God can't change. We have hymns about it. We have teachings about it, that God can never change. And although God's essence, which means God's whole being, is unchanged, that doesn't mean that God does not build a relationship with God's creation, including humanity and everything that God has created, and works with God's creation, to come to a relationship, because God is not separate from creation and creation is not separate from God. So God's essence of who God is, in God's love and mercy and forgiveness and grace, does not change. But God's relationship with us does change as we change and become something different. Some examples of how God, throughout the biblical narrative, has worked with creation, has worked with humanity. God said in the book of Exodus in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Scriptures, God told Moses that if the people who are worshiping the golden calf don't stop what they're doing, if the Israelites don't stop being idolatrous and debaucherous, I'm going to destroy Israel. I'm going to destroy them. You will cease to exist, and I'll allow it to happen. Moses, the prophet Moses, pleads with God and pleads with the people to repent, to turn themselves around and move into a deeper relationship with the unchanging God, whose love and grace and mercy and forgiveness and everything else that comes with God, God's unchangingness, to point towards that. What happens? God works with Moses. God works with the people of Israel. God does not destroy the people of Israel, even though he said that he would. And I'm saying he here because I'm specific to the text. Okay? And so God is a God of redeeming. God says, I want you to focus on love, and I want you to focus on hope and liberation. I don't want you to focus on drawing away from me, right? The second one is the story of Jonah and Nineveh. God says, go to Nineveh and give hope to the people of Nineveh there. And Jonah, who was, I think, probably a disrespectful little character, said, no, God, I'm not doing that. I don't want to do that. Those people of Nineveh are horrible, nasty, and I don't want to go.
Sure, but that's not any different than all of us.
Correct. That's what I'm saying. And God says no, and Nineveh needs this hope and this light. But if Nineveh doesn't turn, I'm going to destroy it. Right? Well, Jonah and the Ninevites have a change of heart. God says that doesn't want something to happen here, or it would be destroyed. And it's very interesting. Actually, if you want a good, interesting read, it's not a very long book, go and read the book of Jonah. Because what's interesting is God is gracious to both Jonah and the Ninevites, but really, really gives emphasis to the Ninevites who changed their mind to be in relationship with God way before Jonah did. And Jonah was the one whom God sent. Interesting. Okay? So, the idea that God can't change is not true. God's essence and being cannot change, but God changes because God is in relationship with God's creation.
We are co-creators.
We're co-creators with God, and that's why, which, as we said before, we are made in the image and likeness of God, and therefore we are in relationship with God.
And part of power is allowing all things. Like, I know that we can be bound to our certain political systems and think that, like, if everybody just allows everything, it's going to be chaos. But just, like, allow your paradox exists in truth, right? So let's, like, just hold the tension here. But imagine you're a parent. Some of you might be, right? Like, I'm a parent. My children are going to do things that I disagree with. I don't get to live their lives for them. Up until a certain point, I get to kind of guide them, but inevitably, the game of ultimate love of parenthood is, like, parenthood is ultimately, I define it as the art of letting go. From the time they're born, you have to, like, let them go a little more each moment. So eventually my children will get in trouble. And I get to kind of be a voice in their ear and kind of guide them. I get to have rules up until a certain point, but they're not going to be 25 following my rules, right? They are going to do things that I disagree with, and my job to love them is to allow it. And I, just as God would tell people and communicate with people like, hey, that's probably not the right way to go, a loving, all-loving God, just like an all-loving parent, is going to say, all right, if that's the path you're going to take, I'm not going to, like, control it. Fine, I'll be here. When you learn that lesson, I will be here. That's what we talk about when we talk about power. Does that?
Well, right, and the argument too is there has been this age-old argument. People say, well, God's saying that God will destroy people, that God will destroy an individual, or God will destroy a whole nation. Well, is God the one who's really destroying it, or is God building a relationship with the individual or the person who's already destroying themselves?
I also want to give some like biblical literacy context here. Like, let's talk about Noah and the ark, right? There were a lot of flood stories in other religions and faiths and communities at the time of the Old Testament, of the Hebrew people writing this story down or sharing this story. The reason why God promises in this text to not kill everybody ever again is because the Hebrew people, the Israelites, were trying to make the point, hey, our God is different. This is actually the first time in known history that a God was portrayed as having mercy and forgiveness. So they're not trying to tell a literal story of like 2x2 animals on a boat. They were trying to make the point by writing this story down. Hey, or not even writing it down yet, but just sharing it and circulating it. Like, hey, you have your flood story? Well, we have one too, and look what our God does. Your God kills everybody over and over and over again. You know what our God does? Our God says, we're going to save you, and I will never do that to you again. I promise. Right? They're trying to show through storytelling, not the telling of literal truths all the time, but through storytelling of people who would have understood many thousands of years ago during this time, hey, our God is forgiving, and this is a new kind of God that you don't know about.
Right. The great beauty of this is that, the Moses story, the Jonah story, the Noah story, is
a new kind of God
is a new kind of God, is a new kind of God, and a God that gives an openness and open arms to. I don't want you to destroy yourself. I want you to be in relationship with me. I want you to be accept my love and do all these things. So the idea that if there's an all-powerful God, then that God cannot change or not be in relationship with creation and humanity is not true. God's essence doesn't change and being doesn't change, but God's change in terms of being in relationship and dealing with God's creation does and can change.
Yeah. Hang in there. We're almost done, but we're going to talk. I'm going to kind of set Dillon up because I know he wants to talk about the resurrection. So I want to make a point that I love. Are you ready for that part?
Yeah, I'm going to be very brief on these last two because my throat is...
Okay. So oftentimes when we think about power today, images of war come to mind, death, killing, right? And I want to frame the resurrection in a very direct way. So for us Christians, we believe Jesus was God in the flesh, right? That means that the resurrection, and let's be honest, most of us would have been in alignment with the Roman Empire more than with Jesus. Those of us who have some privilege and power in this society, no matter what we think, we probably weren't unhoused, enslaved, very oppressed people in Israel. We probably would have been in cahoots and employed by the Roman Empire in some way. So we're probably more like Pontius Pilate than Jesus, a majority of us, right? Would you agree, Dillon?
I would.
Okay, so if you start there, the crucifixion of Jesus, we killed God. Very directly, that's what we did. We killed God. So under our current paradigm of power, we displayed the most toxic kind of power, which is not how I define power, but you know what I'm saying. Hopefully you do at the end of this episode. We displayed this lion's power, right? That Jesus was just teaching against. We displayed the ultimate act of lion's power. We killed God. And you know what God did? As we were killing him, as we were killing Jesus, as we were killing God, as humanity was killing God. I'm going to say over and over again because it's so important. What did Jesus say? What did God say? Forgive them, they know not what they do. There's forgiveness. We are in the act of brutally killing God. And what does God say? Forgive them. Forgive them. They don't know any better. Forgive them. What else happens? It's transformed. So the death of Jesus is not undone, but it is transformed because Jesus is resurrected. And that's power. So whenever we play these games of power, where is God? Waiting for us to say you're forgiven and you're loved, and all of this violence is going to be resurrected and used for good anyway. I don't even know if that's the right way to say it. I don't want to say that like, oh, be violent because it's all okay anyway. No.
I don't think that's at all
not
what
what I'm
you're
trying to
saying.
say.
Nor would we condone that behavior.
Yes, but okay, go ahead. So that kind of sets you up to talk about.
No, so to kind of piggyback off of what Samantha kind of helped set up and gave my voice a little break here, is the resurrection and the ascension of Jesus are power plays, not only power plays historically, but power plays theologically for Christians. And the resurrection is what is an efface, a rebellion against Rome, who could not hold down the message of Jesus even after they put him to death on a cross.
Right.
Rome could not hold down or suppress the message of Jesus of Nazareth, whom Christians believe was God.
In fact, killing him actually made the message louder.
Yes, so Rome crucified Jesus of Nazareth and killed him, but they did not kill his message. Rome also tried to trample down or suppress this message that lived within the followers of Jesus even after his death. And the power of Jesus' resurrection is that Jesus' resurrection gives this new vision that Jesus Christ is alive. The Easter message, the Christian message of Easter, is that Jesus lives and Christ is alive, and that death could not hold Christ, that Rome could not hold Christ, and the fear of death, that something goes away and is no longer, and the fear that the message that Jesus came to bring, the Easter story says that Christ lives, and the message of Christ lives on in both the presence of Christ that is still with us in the risen Christ, and the teachings of Jesus and the Spirit of Jesus that lives on in the baptized followers of the church. And so the power of Easter is that Rome loses, Jesus lives, and the message and work of Christ, of Jesus of Nazareth, lives on in those who are a part of the church, that follow the teachings of Jesus, that continue the work that Jesus has left even after his death. And they're nourished by this living Spirit that lives on in them and lives on.
It really makes me think of young, unarmed black men who are being killed by law enforcement. And in this metaphor, law enforcement is the Roman emperor, Roman Empire. And the young, unarmed black men being killed, it's like they're Jesus. They're the bottom sugar cubes, right? You're killing them, and that every time, these men should not have to die for this to happen. That is not what I'm saying at all. But every time another unarmed black man is being killed by law enforcement, the message gets louder. Mm-hmm. It gets louder and more clear for those bottom sugar cubes. And Jesus, to be clear, was a bottom sugar cube.
Right.
He was not at the top of that pyramid of his social setup. Do you think there's a connection there?
There's a definite connection there. And you can't have Easter. Some people have tried to just stop talking about the ascension of Jesus, and I think it's problematic. The power of Easter, the Easter season, and Easter itself is kind of comes to almost a climax with Jesus' ascension, and not a literal ascension into the clouds and floating up. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the raw power play that is the ascension, that the followers of Jesus, after Jesus died on the cross and was resurrected into a new spiritual and resurrected presence and life, the promise that Jesus lives is both a spiritual individual and in the presence that lives within us. I know that gets kind of weird.
But I say this every time it comes up really quick. It's super quick. The Bible says Jesus died, Christ rose.
Correct.
They use that specifically. Jesus died, Christ rose. It doesn't say Jesus rose. It says Christ rose.
Right.
Okay, go ahead.
Yes. The resurrection of Jesus, the resurrected Christ, was something both the same, but something very, very new, and that is made clear. It was not just the old Jesus. It was something. It was a totally transformed person. Okay, and so the ascension, though, is interesting. Easter and the resurrection remind us that Christ is alive and Christ lives. The presence of Christ, both that presence in its own right, and that presence that lives on in every Christian that continues the life and teachings of Jesus.
And if you read Paul, you can see that he was, I struggle with Paul, but he was awake to this. He saw Jesus everywhere. Mm-hmm. He saw Jesus in other people. So if you read him through that lens, you can see that Paul was awoken to this thought that, like, oh, Christ is in everybody. Christ is in the unlikely characters.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Christ is even in bread and wine. That was interesting. So the ascension part of the Easter message is that the risen Christ ascends to the right hand of God, not the Roman emperor. At the time, Rome and the Roman imperial system and the Roman religion proclaimed that the Roman emperor who was chosen by God at the Roman emperor's death would go to the right hand of God. So when an emperor died, they'd go to the right hand of God, and that made them Lord of all. And the early Christians did not stand for that. Not only did they not believe that the tyrannical Roman emperors were chosen by God, but they definitely did not believe that when those tyrannical Roman emperors died, that they went to the right hand of God to be Lord of all. And so they took those things, and the whole meaning and purpose and power of the ascension of Jesus is that Jesus is Lord of all, not the Roman emperors. And that God has put Jesus as Lord of all at the right hand of God.
Yeah.
And so these power plays of Easter and the resurrection, saying that Christ lives and Christ is Lord, are two of the great power plays of both Rome and the early Jesus followers.
So good. So all of this is to say, be a lamb, not a lion. Be sure to follow us on Instagram at church_chatter_podcast. It'd be really cool if you followed us, commented on our Instagram, shared stuff, commented on our podcast. Not because we're trying to grow, because we honestly don't even really look at those things, but because it helps us to know that people are listening. It makes us feel like we're not talking into the ether. All right, have a good week, everyone.